The Nebraska winter of 1873 was merciless. Snow fell in thick sheets across the prairie, erasing roads and landmarks, turning the world into a vast white void. Margaret Sullivan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood in the doorway of what had been her home for the past 3 years. At 24, she looked far older, her once bright eyes dulled by grief and hardship. "Time's up, Mrs. Sullivan," the landlord said, not unkindly but firmly. "I gave you 2 extra weeks already. Can't afford to wait no more." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She'd sold everything worth selling, her mother's cameo brooch, the silver brush set from her wedding, even little Emma's christening dress. All that remained fit into a single carpet bag that sat at her feet, pathetically small for a life's belongings. The cholera had taken them both within days of each other. First Emma, her precious daughter, barely 5 years old with corn silk hair and her father's blue eyes. Then Thomas, her husband, who'd fought so hard to live, gripping her hand and promising he'd get better, that they'd start fresh come spring. But spring never came for them. "Where will you go?" the landlord asked, shifting uncomfortably. "I have a sister in Chicago." Margaret lied. She had no one. Her parents were long dead, and she'd lost touch with her only brother when he'd gone west seeking gold. But she couldn't bear the pity in the man's eyes. She picked up her carpet bag and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind cut through her worn dress like 1,000 needles. Behind her, she heard the door close with a finality that made her stumble. She didn't look back. The town of Elm Creek was small, just a cluster of buildings huddled against the endless prairie. Margaret made her way down the main street, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. She'd already been to every establishment seeking work. The general store didn't need help. The boarding house was full. Even the saloon had turned her away, though she'd been desperate enough to ask. At the edge of town, she paused. The road east toward civilization was barely visible through the falling snow. She had no money for the stage, no food, no shelter. The closest town was 40 miles away, an impossible distance in this weather. Margaret turned west instead, toward the open prairie. Perhaps it was madness, but she couldn't face the pitying looks of the townspeople as she slowly starved. Better to meet her end on her own terms, under the vast sky that had once filled her with such hope when she and Thomas had first arrived. The wind picked up as she walked, driving snow into her face. Her thin boots were soon soaked through, her feet numb. She stumbled over hidden rocks and prairie dog holes, falling more than once. Each time it was harder to get up. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time lost meaning in the white wilderness. Margaret's world shrank to the next step, the next breath. Ice crystals formed on her eyelashes. Her hands, clutching the carpet bag, could no longer feel its weight. When she fell for the last time, she didn't try to rise. The snow was soft beneath her, almost warm compared to the wind. She thought of Emma's laugh, of Thomas's strong hands as he'd built their little house. Soon she'd be with them again. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the snow begin to cover her. Her breathing slowed. The wind's howl faded to a distant whisper. Then, through the haze of approaching darkness, she heard something else, the crunch of footsteps. A shadow fell across her, blocking the wind. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, shaking her. She forced her eyes open, expecting to see Thomas come to guide her home. Instead, she found herself looking into the dark eyes of a stranger, an Indian warrior, his face painted with unfamiliar symbols, his long black hair whipping in the wind. Terror shot through her exhausted body. All the stories she'd heard in town flooded back, tales of scalping, torture, women carried off to fates worse than death. She tried to scream but could only manage a weak whimper. The man, Kuruk, though she didn't know his name yet, studied her with an expression she couldn't read. His hands were gentle despite their strength. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, the words flowing like water over stones. For a long moment, he seemed to wrestle with himself. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the the weight of all the wrongs done to his people warring with something else. Compassion, perhaps, or simple human decency. Finally, he made his decision. In one fluid motion, he lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. Margaret wanted to struggle, but her body had nothing left to give. She could only lie limp against his chest as he carried her through the storm. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of movement, of being carried to somewhere warm and safe. Then darkness claimed her completely. When Margaret woke, the first thing she noticed was warmth, real warmth, not the false comfort of freezing to death. She lay on a bed of pine boughs covered with soft furs. Above her, rock walls curved into shadows. A fire crackled nearby, painting dancing patterns on the cave walls. Panic returned with consciousness. She sat up too quickly, making her head spin. The warrior sat across the fire, watching her with those unreadable dark eyes. He'd removed his heavy winter clothes, wearing now a simple deerskin shirt and leggings. Without the paint and in the fire's gentle light, he looked younger, perhaps 30 winters. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture and spoke again in that fluid language. When she only stared, he tried again, this time in broken English. "You safe, no harm." Margaret pulled the fur blanket higher, acutely aware of her vulnerability. But as she looked around, she noticed things that didn't fit the terrible stories. Her carpetbag sat neatly beside her, unopened. Her boots had been removed and placed near the fire to dry. He had wrapped her feet in soft cloth. The warrior rose slowly, careful not to startle her. From a pack near the wall, he produced a wooden bowl and filled it from a pot hanging over the fire. The smell of rabbit stew made her stomach clench with hunger. He set the bowl within her reach and retreated to his side of the fire. "Eat," he said simply. "You need strength." Margaret's hands shook as she picked up the bowl. The first sip burned her throat, but it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. She tried to eat slowly, with dignity, but hunger won. She drained the bowl in moments. Without being asked, he refilled it. This time she managed to eat more slowly, studying him over the rim. His face bore old scars, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed to echo her own. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy from the cold. "Why did you save me?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his words were careful, chosen with thought. "My wife, my daughters, soldiers came. 2 winters passed." He gestured toward the storm outside. "Found them in snow. Too late. Could not save." The words were simple, halting, but Margaret understood. The grief in his voice was universal, crossing all boundaries of language and culture. "Today, I could save, so I save." Tears burned Margaret's eyes. This savage, this enemy she'd been taught to fear, had shown her more kindness than any of her own people. He'd seen her dying in the snow and chosen mercy over vengeance, humanity over hatred. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and turned his attention to the fire, giving her the privacy of her tears. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cave, an unexpected peace settled between 2 souls who had lost everything and yet, perhaps, found something worth saving in each other. The storm lasted 3 days. Margaret learned to mark time by the rhythm of their shared existence, the morning ritual of rebuilding the fire, the quiet preparation of meals, the long afternoons when the wind howled like a living thing outside their shelter. On the 2nd day, Karuk began teaching her small things. He showed her which wood burned longest, how to bank the coals to last through the night. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he demonstrated, and Margaret found herself studying the careful precision of his movements. "Pine burns fast, much smoke," he explained, setting aside those branches. "Oak, better, burns slow, steady." Margaret nodded, filing the information away. She'd never had to think about such things before. Thomas had always handled the fire, the wood, all the heavy work. Now she watched intently as Karuk showed her how to feel the weight of each piece, how to tell seasoned wood from green. "You try," he said, gesturing to the pile. Her first attempts were clumsy. She chose poorly, mixing green wood with dry, but Karuk was patient, correcting without criticism. When she finally selected a proper mix, his nod of approval warmed her more than the fire. As the days passed, they began to share more than survival skills. The language barrier remained, but grief needed no translation. "Emma," Margaret said one evening, pulling out a small photograph from her carpet bag. The image was fading, but her daughter's sweet face was still visible. "My daughter, 5 years old when the sickness took her." Karuk studied the photograph with reverence, handling it as carefully as spun glass. From his own pack, he withdrew a small beaded pouch. Inside was a lock of black hair tied with a strip of red cloth. "Ayana," he said softly. "My daughter, 7 winters." He held up 7 fingers to be sure she understood. Laughed like water over rocks, always running, always. He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't come. But Margaret understood. She saw it in the way his fingers trembled slightly as he returned the hair to its pouch. "And your wife?" she asked gently. "Nahimana, it means mystic. She could see things others could not, dreams that came true." His voice grew distant. "She saw the soldiers coming in a dream. We tried to run, but the snow, like now, they could not run fast enough." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. 2 hearts bearing similar wounds recognized each other across the divide of culture and language. "Thomas was a good man," Margaret found herself saying. "Came out from Pennsylvania to farm. He had such dreams for us, for Emma. Built our house with his own hands, every board, every nail. When he got sick, he fought so hard, kept saying he'd beat it, that we'd plant corn come spring." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I've never told anyone that, people in town. They just said it was God's will, that I should accept it and move on. But how do you move on when everything you are is buried in the ground?" "You don't move on," Karuk said quietly. "You carry them. Here." He placed a hand over his heart. "Sorrow shared is smaller," my grandmother's words. That night, for the first time since the burial, Margaret wept freely. Not the silent tears of public grief, but the raw, ugly sobs that she'd kept locked inside. Karuk didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He simply fed the fire and let her grieve. On the 3rd night, when the wind finally began to quiet, Karuk brought out a wooden flute. The melody he played was unlike anything Margaret had heard, haunting and beautiful, speaking of loss and longing and something that might have been hope. "My grandfather made," he explained when the last note faded. "Taught me when I was small. Music carries prayers to the spirits." "What were you praying for?" Margaret asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Understanding, peace, maybe for the storm in here." He touched his chest. "To be quiet like the storm outside." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the ice that had formed around her heart. "Will you teach me a song?" His surprise was evident, but he nodded. He played a simple melody, just a few notes repeated. Margaret hummed along, stumbling at first, then finding the rhythm. It wasn't beautiful. Her voice was rough from crying and disuse, but it was something, a small act of creation after so much destruction. When the storm finally broke, they ventured outside together. The world had been remade in white, sculptured into fantastic shapes by the wind. The sun on the snow was blinding after days in the cave. "We need food," Karuk said, studying the horizon. "Storm drove everything deep, but here, look." He knelt, pointing to tiny marks in the snow. To Margaret, they looked like random dimples, but Karuk saw a story. "Rabbit," he explained. "Came out early morning, hungry, like us. We follow. Maybe find Warren." He began to walk, moving with a grace that seemed impossible in the deep snow. Margaret struggled to keep up, her skirts dragging, her breath coming in gasps. "Here," Kuruk said, returning to her side. "Step where I step. Use my path. Easier." It was such a simple thing, but it spoke volumes. He could have ranged ahead, caught whatever game he needed. Instead, he slowed his pace to hers, teaching as they went. "See there, where snow is thin, wind blows across, makes hard crust, better for walking. And there," he pointed to a cluster of bare branches. "Rose hips, good food, sour but fills belly." Margaret watched him gather the withered fruit, noting which bushes he chose and which he passed by. Everything had meaning in his world, every choice deliberate. They didn't find the rabbit that day, but Kuruk's snares caught two the next morning. He showed Margaret how to skin and clean them, her squeamishness overcome by practical necessity. She learned to stretch the hide, to waste nothing. "In my world," she said one evening as they shared their simple meal, "women don't do such things. It's not proper." Kuruk considered this. "In my world, all must know all things. Man might fall sick, woman must hunt, woman might be with child, man must tan hide, make clothes. Survival has no proper." Margaret found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. "You're right, of course, proper won't keep me warm or fed." "You learn fast," he said, and she could hear approval in his voice. "Strong, many would give up, wait for death. You choose life." "I didn't at first," she admitted. "When you found me, I was ready to die, wanted to die." And now, Margaret considered the question. The pain was still there, would always be there, but alongside it, something else was growing. Not happiness, not yet, but a kind of stubborn determination. "Now I think, Emma wouldn't want me to give up. Thomas fought so hard to live. Maybe I dishonor them by choosing death." "No dishonor in grief," Kuruk said firmly, "but honor in choosing to live despite grief. That takes courage." As the days passed, their communication improved. Kuruk's English grew more fluid with practice, and Margaret picked up words in his language. Apache, he told her, though that was what others called them. His people called themselves Ndi, meaning simply the people. She learned that Kuruk meant bear, a name given for his strength, that the cave was a winter shelter his family had used for generations, that he'd been traveling to trade furs when the storm caught him, driving him to seek shelter in the familiar place. "And then I found you," he said one night, almost passed by, snow covering everything, but something, maybe Ayana's spirit, maybe ancestors. Something said, "Look again." Margaret shivered, thinking how close she'd come to her wish. "I'm glad you looked again." "Yes," he said simply, "I also am glad." The admission hung between them, fragile as spring ice, neither quite ready to examine what it meant, but both aware that something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just two people sharing shelter from a storm. They were two souls who had found, in their shared sorrow, an unexpected connection that transcended the boundaries their worlds had built between them. The decision to leave the cave came with the first real thaw. Water dripped from icicles, and the sun held actual warmth when it touched their faces. Kuruk studied the sky with the knowledge of generations, reading signs Margaret couldn't yet see. "We cannot stay," he said one morning. "Soon others will come. Hunters, soldiers, this place too close to white settlements." Margaret felt a flutter of panic. The cave had become sanctuary, the first place she'd felt safe since losing her family. "Where will we go?" "South, through the mountains. I know a valley. Hidden. Good water, game, shelter. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If you wish to come." The invitation hung between them. Margaret understood what he wasn't saying, that she could return to town, to her own people, that he would take her back if she asked. But the thought of returning to those pitying looks, to a world where she had no place, made her stomach turn. "I'll come," she said quietly. They prepared for the journey with meticulous care. Kuruk fashioned snowshoes from willow branches and rawhide, teaching Margaret how to walk in them. Her first attempts were disasters. She tangled her feet, fell repeatedly, once landing face first in a drift. But Kuruk never laughed, never showed impatience. "Like dancing," he explained, demonstrating the rolling gait needed. "Feel the rhythm, don't fight the snow, move with it." By the third day, she could manage short distances without falling. Her legs ached and her back screamed, but she felt a pride in the accomplishment that surprised her. They left on a morning when the sky was the pale blue of robin's eggs. Margaret carried what she could, her few remaining possessions and some of the supplies Kuruk had prepared. The load was heavy, but she didn't complain. She was learning that complaints changed nothing, only action mattered. The first day's travel was the hardest. They climbed steadily, leaving the familiar prairie behind for the foothills of the mountains. The terrain was rough, strewn with hidden rocks and fallen timber. More than once, Margaret's foot slipped, and only Kuruk's quick reflexes kept her from sliding down the steep slopes. As the sun began to sink, they reached a small plateau. Margaret collapsed, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle burned. Her hands were raw despite the mittens Kuruk had made from rabbit fur. "We stop here tonight," Kuruk said, already gathering wood for a fire. Margaret wanted to help, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She watched, frustrated by her own weakness, as he efficiently set up camp clearing snow, building a windbreak from pine boughs, starting a fire with practiced ease. "I'm sorry," she said when he brought her tea made from pine needles. "I'm slowing you down." He settled beside her, his own cup steaming in the cold air. "First time I made this journey, I was 7 winters. My father carried me last part, cried like baby." He smiled at the memory. "Strength comes with doing. You are stronger than yesterday. Tomorrow, stronger than today." That night, they slept close to the fire, wrapped in their separate blankets but near enough that Margaret could hear his breathing. She lay awake, watching the stars through the pine branches, thinking about the strangeness of her situation. A month ago, she'd been a respectable widow in a small Nebraska town. Now she was following an Apache warrior into the wilderness, leaving behind everything she'd known. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt an odd sense of rightness, as if she'd been traveling toward this moment all her life. The second day brought new challenges. They had to cross a frozen stream, the ice treacherous with hidden weak spots. Kuruk went first, testing each step with a long stick. Halfway across, they heard an ominous crack. "Move quick," he said urgently, "but don't run. Spread weight." Margaret's heart pounded as she followed his exact path. The ice groaned beneath her feet. Just as she reached the far bank, the section they'd crossed collapsed with a splash that sent her scrambling up the slope. "Good," Kuruk said, and she heard real pride in his voice. "You didn't panic. Panic kills faster than cold." As they climbed higher, Margaret began to struggle with the thin air. Her breath came in gasps, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. Without a word, Kuruk took part of her load, adding it to his own pack. "No," she protested, "I can manage." "Pride is luxury we cannot afford," he said firmly. "You collapse, we both suffer. This is wisdom, not weakness." They rested more frequently after that, and Margaret noticed Kuruk always found reasons to stop that had nothing to do with her exhaustion, checking their direction, examining animal tracks, gathering medicinal plants he spotted. On the third day, disaster struck. Margaret's foot caught on a hidden root, and she went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. The pain was immediate and intense, bringing tears to her eyes. Karuk was beside her instantly, his hands gentle as he examined the injury. "Not broken," he said after careful prodding, "but bad twist. Cannot walk on it." "I can try," Margaret insisted. Attempting to stand, the pain shot through her like lightning, and she would have fallen if he hadn't caught her. Without hesitation, Karuk fashioned a travois from pine branches and their blankets. But when he tried to pull it through the deep snow, it became clear the makeshift sled wouldn't work in the mountainous terrain. "Leave me," Margaret said, the words bitter as alkali water. "You can send help back." Karuk's response was to turn his back to her and kneel. "Climb on." "I can't. I'm too heavy, too—" "Climb on," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. With no choice, Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck, trying to make herself as small as possible. He stood with seeming ease, adjusting her weight, and began to walk. The next hours were agony, not from her ankle, but from embarrassment and the intimate proximity. She could feel his heart beating, steady and strong. His hair smelled of wood smoke and pine, despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them. She felt safer than she had in years. They made slow progress, but Karuk never complained, never suggested stopping. When they finally reached the abandoned cabin he'd been aiming for, the sun was setting, painting the snow pink and gold. The cabin was small, just one room with gaps in the chinking and a partially collapsed roof. But it had walls and most of a floor, luxury after nights in the open. Karuk set her down carefully and immediately set about making the place habitable. He patched the largest gaps with pine boughs and mud, rebuilt a corner of the roof with the salvaged timber. Margaret, confined to sitting by her injured ankle, sorted through their supplies and prepared a simple meal from their dwindling stores. That night, as wind whistled through the remaining gaps, they huddled close to their small fire. The cabin was too damaged to hold heat well, and their breath misted in the air. "Tomorrow I'll set snares." Karuk said, "You rest, heal. Few days, then we continue." "I'm holding you back," Margaret said miserably. "You could have been at your valley by now." He was quiet for a long moment. "When Ayana was small," he finally said. "She loved to gather berries, always wandered, always exploring. One day she fell, hurt her knee badly. Nahimana was ready to return to camp, but Ayana cried, all day gathering, no berries to show." He smiled at the memory. "So I carried her on shoulders, went to best berry places. She picked until her basket overflowed, juice staining her face purple. That night, she shared berries with whole camp, proud." He turned to look at Margaret directly. The berries were not important. Her joy was important. The journey, not the destination. "You understand." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "But I'm not your daughter. I'm not even—" "What, not my people?" He shrugged. "Lines on maps, colors of skin. These matter to those who have forgotten we all walk same earth, breathe same air. In the old stories, first man and first woman had many children. All colors, all kinds, still family." The simple philosophy struck Margaret deeply. In all her years of church-going, she'd never heard such clear truth. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you saved me too." "How?" she asked, startled. "Before finding you, I was—" He searched for words. "Empty, like this cabin, still standing, but the life blown out through the holes. Helping you, teaching you, it gives purpose, makes me remember who I was before the sorrow." They sat in comfortable silence, feeding small sticks to the fire. Outside, wolves howled in the distance. But the sound didn't frighten Margaret as it once might have. She was beginning to understand that the true dangers in this world rarely announced themselves so clearly. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said. The one who said sorrow shared is smaller. Karuk's face softened. She was a medicine woman, very wise, very stubborn, said the spirits gave her dreams to guide the people. When I was young, I thought she was. He made a circling motion near his temple. Touched in the head, Margaret suggested, smiling. Yes, but as I grew, I saw her dreams come true. Small things, big things. She dreamed of white men coming before we ever saw one. Dreamed of the sickness that would follow. His voice grew sad. Also dreamed that some would bridge the worlds, said the only way forward was together, or not at all. Do you believe that? He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. I am beginning to... That night, as the fire burned low and the cold crept closer, they shared the blankets without discussion, lying back to back for warmth. Margaret felt the solid presence of him, heard his breathing deepen into sleep, for the first time since the deaths. She didn't dream of graves. Instead, she dreamed of spring valleys and clear water, of a place where sorrow might truly become smaller when shared between two hearts that understood its weight. The winter fought them every step of the way, even after Margaret's ankle healed enough to walk. The journey to Karuk's valley took another week of hard travel. Blizzards came from nowhere, forcing them to shelter in whatever protection they could find. A grove of thick pines, an overhang of rock. Once in a snow cave, Karuk dug when no other option presented itself. Through it all, they worked as one. Margaret learned to read the weather signs. The way clouds gathered over certain peaks meant snow within hours. How the behavior of small animals predicted storms. Karuk taught her to build fires in the worst conditions, to find dry wood in a world of wet, to bank coals so they'd last through the longest night. See how the smoke rises, he said one evening as they huddled in their temporary shelter. Straight up means good weather holds, but when it drifts low, stays close to ground. Storm coming. Margaret filed away each lesson, understanding that in this world, knowledge meant survival. She thought of her old life, where her biggest concern had been whether the bread would rise properly or if her stitching was straight enough. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The night they finally reached the valley, Margaret thought she was hallucinating from exhaustion. They crested a final ridge as the sun was setting, and below them lay a bowl of land protected by high peaks on three sides. Even in winter's grip, she could see the promise of it, a winding stream that hadn't frozen completely, meadows that would bloom with spring, clusters of evergreens offering shelter. Home, Karuk said simply. Near the far end of the valley sat the cabin he'd promised, small but solid, built of good logs with a stone chimney. Abandoned, he'd said, by trappers who'd moved on to richer grounds. They made their way down as darkness fell, picking their path carefully. Margaret's legs shook with fatigue, but excitement gave her strength. A real home. 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak. After weeks of travel, it seemed like a palace. The cabin was dusty but sound. Karuk immediately set about lighting a fire while Margaret explored their new shelter. One room, but larger than it appeared from outside. A sleeping platform built into one corner. Shelves and pegs for storage. Even a small window covered with scraped hide to let in light while keeping out wind. It's perfect, she breathed. That first night in the valley, they ate the last of their traveling food and planned for the days ahead. There was so much to do, repairs to the cabin, food to hunt and gather, firewood to cut and stack. But for the moment, they simply sat by their fire, grateful to have arrived. I thought I'd die before I saw another spring, Margaret admitted, staring into the flames. When you found me, I was ready for it, wanted it. And now, Karuk asked. Now? She considered carefully. Now I think about tomorrow. What needs doing? What I need to learn. It's not happiness exactly, but it's something. Beginning, he said, like seed under snow. Not growing yet, but waiting. Over the following weeks, They fell into a rhythm of survival. Karuk hunted while Margaret worked on the cabin, filling gaps with mud and moss, organizing their meager supplies. She learned to stretch a rabbit to feed them for days, making stew, then soup from the bones, finally cracking them for marrow. Evenings were for harder lessons. Karuk taught her to work hide, showing her how to scrape it clean, work it until soft. Her first attempts were disasters, too thin in places, holes where she'd scraped too hard. But gradually, her hands learned the rhythm. "Why are you teaching me all this?" she asked one night as she struggled with a particularly stubborn deer hide. "You need to know," he said simply. "But you're here, you know these things." He was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Life is uncertain. Today I'm here. Tomorrow," he shrugged. "Better you know too much than too little." The implication chilled her. She'd lost so much already. The thought of losing this unexpected friendship was unbearable, but she understood the practicality of it. In this world, anyone could be gone between one heartbeat and the next. As winter deepened, they grew closer in ways neither quite acknowledged. Working side by side, sharing meals, spending long evenings by the fire, it created an intimacy that transcended their different worlds. Margaret found herself watching for his return from hunting, her heart lifting when she spotted his familiar form. Karuk began sharing more stories of his childhood, his people, painting a picture of a world she'd never imagined. One particularly fierce blizzard trapped them inside for 3 days. By the second day, they'd run through most conversations. Margaret darned their clothes while Karuk worked on new arrows. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the wind's howl and the fire's crackle. "Teach me something," Margaret said suddenly, "words in your language." Karuk looked up, surprised. "What words?" "Useful things. Hello, thank you, friend." He smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Yati, hello. Ahe, thank you. Shikis, my friend." Margaret repeated them, mangling the pronunciation terribly. Karuk corrected her patiently, showing her how to shape the unfamiliar sounds. They spent the afternoon like that, her learning basic words while he improved his English. "Your turn," he said eventually. "Teach me white people words I don't know." Margaret thought. "Hope," she said finally. "It means believing good things might come, even when everything seems dark." "Hope," he repeated, testing the word. "We say ayooni, but is more than hope, is like—" He struggled to translate. "Like knowing sun returns even in longest night." "That's beautiful," Margaret said softly. "Practical," he corrected. "Sun always returns. Fact, not hope." That night, lying on opposite sides of the fire as always, Margaret spoke into the darkness. "I used to pray every night. After Thomas and Emma died, I stopped. Couldn't see the point." She heard Karuk shift on his bedroll. "White people God is strange to me, lives far away in sky. Our spirits are here in wind, in mountains, in animals. Always close." "Do you pray to them?" "Not pray like white people. More like conversation, thanking deer for its life, asking wind to be gentle, greeting sun each morning." Margaret considered this. "Could you teach me a greeting for the sun?" "Ha'a, shinada," he said slowly. "Means the sun rises again," said with grateful heart. She repeated it until he was satisfied with her pronunciation. The next morning, standing outside the cabin as dawn broke over the mountains, she whispered the words. Beside her, Karuk smiled approval. As the days passed, their partnership deepened. They moved around each other with practiced ease, anticipating needs without words. Margaret would have water heating when she heard him returning from checking snares. Karuk would bring in extra wood when he sensed a storm approaching, without being asked. One evening, as Margaret struggled to mend a torn seam by firelight, Karuk silently moved closer, angling his body to block the light from the fire so it fell better on her work. Such a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She looked up to thank him and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You are different," he said, "from when I found you." "Thinner," she said wryly, trying for levity. The winter diet of meat and whatever plants they'd stored was far from the plenty she'd known before. "No, stronger. Here." He touched his temple. "And here," his hand moved to his heart. "Before, you were like rabbit in snare, waiting for end. Now you fight. Now you live." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I had a good teacher." Maybe, or maybe strength was always there, just needed reason to show itself. They were sitting close, closer than usual. Margaret was acutely aware of the space between them, charged with something unnamed. She thought of Thomas, of the life she'd planned with him. That seemed like another lifetime now, a story that had happened to someone else. "Kuruk," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. He seemed to understand. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I am Apache. You are white woman. World outside this valley would not understand." "I know," she whispered. "But here, in this place." He gestured to encompass their small world. "Here we are, just two people who choose to live instead of die, who understand sorrow and strength." "Is that enough?" she asked. "For now," he said. "Tomorrow is tomorrow's worry." Later, as the fire died to coals and the cabin grew cold, Margaret made a decision. She gathered her blanket and moved to the other side of the fire, laying it next to his, not touching, but close enough to share warmth. "Cold night," she said by way of explanation. "Yes," he agreed. "Very cold." They lay back to back, the space between them carefully maintained, but somehow less than before. Margaret listened to his breathing, felt the warmth radiating from him. For the first time in so long, she didn't feel alone. "Kuruk," she whispered. Thank you for saving me, for teaching me, for everything." He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, so soft she almost missed it. He to you also, for reminding me why we choose to live." Outside, the wind howled through the valley, but inside their small cabin, something new and fragile and precious had taken root. Like the seeds beneath the snow, it would wait for spring to show what it might become, but it was there, undeniable, warming them better than any fire. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered the words she'd learned, "Ha'ashinada." The sun rises again, and for the first time in a year, she truly believed it would. The peace of their valley shattered on a morning when the snow had begun to soften with spring's approach. Margaret was outside gathering the last of their stored root vegetables when she heard the horses, many horses, moving fast through the lower valley. Kuruk appeared from the forest line, moving with urgent silence. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the cabin. "Inside, now." Through the small window, they watched 8 riders approach, white men, heavily armed, wearing the mix of military surplus and frontier gear that marked them as irregulars, the kind who hunted Indians for bounty or sport. "Stay quiet," Kuruk whispered. "Maybe they passed by." But the riders had seen the smoke from their chimney. They spread out, surrounding the cabin with practiced efficiency. Margaret recognized the type. She'd seen them in town, heard their boasts about clearing out the savages. "Hello, the cabin." The leader's voice was rough with tobacco and whiskey. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like." Kuruk's hand moved to his knife. Margaret caught it, shaking her head. 8 armed men against 1. It would be slaughter. "I'll go," she whispered. "Tell them I'm alone, traveling to California. Maybe they'll leave." "No, they see Apache sign everywhere. My tracks, my work." Before they could argue further, the door exploded inward. Men flooded in, guns drawn. Margaret instinctively stepped in front of Karuk, her hands raised. "Wait!" she cried. "Please don't shoot!" The leader, a scarred man with cold gray eyes, looked between them with growing comprehension. His lips curled in disgust. Well, what have we here, a white woman living with a savage? "This man saved my life," Margaret said, forcing her voice steady. "I was dying in the snow. He showed Christian charity when my own people turned me away." "Christian," the man spat tobacco juice on their clean floor. "No savage knows anything about Christian anything. More like he kept you for other purposes." The implication made Margaret's skin crawl, but she held her ground. "You're wrong. He's been nothing but honorable. More honorable than men who would break into a peaceful home with guns drawn." The scarred man, Crawford, she heard one of the others call him, studied her with calculating eyes. She remembered him now, from town. He'd tried to court her after Thomas died, growing angry when she refused his advances. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, false sympathy dripping from every word. "Poor widow Sullivan. Folks in town been wondering what became of you. Figured you froze in that blizzard. Never imagined you'd taken up with a red devil." "I've taken up with no one," Margaret said firmly. "This man helped me survive winter. Nothing more." Crawford's smile was ugly. "That's so. Then you won't mind coming back to town with us. Leave the savage here. We'll take care of him." The casual way he said it, the anticipation in the other men's eyes, made Margaret's decision instant and irrevocable. "No, no," Crawford's voice turned dangerous. "You'd choose a savage over your own kind. I choose the man who saved my life over men who break down doors and threaten violence." Margaret shot back. "I choose kindness over cruelty, regardless of skin color. If that makes me a traitor to my race, so be it." Crawford backhanded her so fast she didn't see it coming. Pain exploded across her cheek, and she tasted blood. Karuk surged forward with a snarl, but 3 men wrestled him down, binding his hands. "Seems the savage has corrupted you proper," Crawford said, rubbing his knuckles. "But don't worry. We know how to fix that. Boys, bring them both. We'll let the town see what happens to Indian lovers and their pets." They were dragged from the cabin, hands bound, thrown across horses like sacks of grain. Margaret caught Karuk's eye as they rode, trying to communicate without words. His face was stone, but she saw the rage burning beneath, not for himself, but for her. The journey back toward civilization was a nightmare. Crawford's men made sport of them, suggesting increasingly vile fates that awaited. Margaret bit her tongue until it bled, knowing any response would only make things worse. They camped that night in a box canyon, the men drinking and boasting around their fire. Margaret and Karuk were tied to a wagon wheel, far enough from the fire to freeze but close enough to hear every word. "Should just do them both here," one man suggested. Drink, slurring his words. "Save the trouble of hauling them back." "No," Crawford said. "The savage dies public. Let every red devil for 100 miles know what happens when they touch white women. As for her," his eyes found Margaret in the darkness. "She needs teaching proper behavior. I'll see to that personal." Margaret's stomach turned. She'd rather die than submit to this man's teaching. Beside her, Karuk shifted slightly. "When I move, you run," he breathed, so quiet she barely heard. "No matter what." "I won't leave you." "You will. Promise." Before she could respond, chaos erupted. War cries split the night as Apache warriors descended from the canyon walls. Arrows whistled through the air, finding targets with deadly precision. The camp exploded into violence. In the confusion, Karuk somehow slipped his bonds. Margaret realized he'd been working at them all along. He pulled her free, shoving her toward the darkness. "Run!" But Crawford was there, pistol raised. Time slowed as Margaret saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the barrel aimed at Karuk's heart. Without thought, she threw herself forward. The bullet took her high in the shoulder, spinning her around. She heard Kuruk roar her name as she fell. Then hands were lifting her, carrying her, as the battle raged behind them. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Flashes of memory, Kuruk's face above her, twisted with fear. The rhythmic gait of a horse, hands, surprisingly gentle, working at her wound. Voices speaking in Apache, urgent and worried. When she finally woke properly, she was in an Apache dwelling, a wiki-up, her scattered mind supplied. An elderly woman sat beside her, grinding something in a stone bowl. "Kuruk," Margaret croaked. The woman looked up, her weathered face kind. She said something in Apache, then seemed to remember Margaret wouldn't understand. "He lives, watches outside, waits for you to wake." "How long?" "3 days. The bullet came out clean, but fever took you. We thought—" She shrugged. "But you are strong, like Apache woman." Kuruk appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by their voices. The relief on his face when he saw her awake made Margaret's eyes burn with tears. "You foolish woman," he said, dropping beside her pallet. "Why did you do that?" "Same reason you carried me through the snow," she whispered. "We save each other. That's what we do." He took her hand carefully, mindful of her injury. "Crawford." "Dead. My brother's arrow." There was no regret in his voice. "The others scattered. We'll think twice before hunting Apache again. Your people, will they accept me?" Kuruk glanced at the elderly woman, who nodded slightly. "My grandmother says you have Apache heart in white body. Says the spirits brought you to us for a reason." "Your grandmother, but I thought—" "Medicine woman for this band. When runners brought word of the attack, of a white woman who stood with Apache against her own kind, she said to bring you here." He smiled slightly. "Said she dreamed of you. Been waiting." Margaret studied the old woman with new interest. The medicine woman studied her right back, then spoke at length in Apache. Kuruk translated. "She says sorrow brought you to us, but love makes you stay. Says you have choosing to make, can return to white world. Tell them you were prisoner. They would believe, or stay. Learn our ways fully. Become one of people. But must understand is hard path. Some will never accept. Will always be between worlds." Margaret thought of the life waiting for her in the white world. The restrictions, the expectations, the men like Crawford who saw her as property to be claimed. Then she thought of the valley, of winter nights by the fire, of the man who'd taught her to live again. "I've already chosen," she said quietly. "I chose the moment I stood between you and those guns. Maybe even before that. Maybe the moment you pulled me from the snow." The medicine woman smiled, speaking again. Kuruk's translation was soft with emotion. She says, "Then welcome, daughter. Your journey was long, but you have come home." As Margaret lay healing in the Apache camp, watching Kuruk move among his people, seeing the respect they showed him, the easy way he smiled here that she'd rarely seen in their valley, she understood something profound. Home wasn't a place or a people. It was where you chose to stand. Who you chose to stand with. When the world demanded you choose. She'd lost everything that had defined her. Husband, child, position, respectability. But in that loss, she'd found something else. Found herself. Found strength she never knew existed. Found love in the most unexpected place. When Kuruk sat with her that evening, teaching her new words in his language, his hand resting lightly over hers, Margaret whispered a truth that no longer frightened her. "I'm not lost anymore." "No," he agreed, understanding all the layers of meaning in those simple words. "You are found." The Apache camp became Margaret's world as she healed. At first, she was aware of the suspicious looks, the mothers who pulled their children away, the warriors who watched her with distrust. She couldn't blame them. How many white people had brought death to their camps? But Kuruk's grandmother, who she learned was called Guyen, meaning wise woman, became her fierce advocate. The old woman would appear whenever tensions rose, her presence alone enough to quiet dissent. Under her protection, Margaret began to learn. The women taught her reluctantly at first, showing her how to prepare traditional foods, how to tan hides properly, how to bead and weave. Her clumsy fingers and pale skin marked her as an outsider, but she persisted. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept her efforts, if not her presence. The real test came from an unexpected source, Nasha, a young woman with fierce beauty and fiercer pride, confronted Margaret by the river where women gathered water. "You should not be here," Nasha said in accented English. "You bring danger to us all." Margaret straightened from filling her water vessel. Her shoulders still ached from the bullet wound, but she refused to show weakness. "I didn't ask to come here. Your people brought me. To save Kuruk, not to stay." Nasha's eyes flashed. "Do you know what the white soldiers do when they find Apache camps? Do you know how many they kill seeking one white woman?" "I know what white men do," Margaret said quietly. "I've seen their cruelty. That's why I stand with Kuruk." "Stand with him," Nasha laughed bitterly. "You know nothing. I was promised to him before his wife died. Would have been his wife if not for the raid. Now he looks at you and I am forgotten." Understanding dawned. This wasn't about Margaret being white, or not entirely. This was about a woman's broken heart. "I'm sorry," Margaret said simply. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "Your meaning doesn't matter. Your presence matters." Nasha stepped closer. "The grandmothers say you protected him, took a bullet meant for him. They say this makes you Apache in spirit. I say it makes you a fool. He would have survived. Our men know how to fight, but you make him weak." "How do I make him weak?" "He thinks of you instead of war. Speaks of returning to that valley, of living apart from the band. A true Apache lives with his people, fights for his people. You make him forget who he is." Margaret felt the truth in those words. Kuruk had spoken of returning to the valley once she healed, of the life they could build there. She'd thought it romantic. Now she saw it differently, as exile, as loss. "What would you have me do?" Margaret asked. Nasha studied her for a long moment. "Leave. Tell him you cannot stay. Return to your people. Let him remember who he is meant to be." That night, Margaret sat with Guyen as the old woman worked on a ceremonial dress. The medicine woman had taken to teaching her in the evenings, sharing stories and wisdom along with practical skills. "You are troubled," Guyen observed, not looking up from her beadwork. "Nasha says I make Kuruk weak, that I pull him from his people." Nasha sees with young eyes, sees only what is lost, not what is found. The old woman's fingers never paused in their work. Kuruk was already lost when you found each other. Death of wife and child broke something in him. He went through motions of living but was ghost walking. And now? Now he lives, laughs, plans for tomorrow. Guyen looked up, her ancient eyes sharp. "This is weakness." "But the valley, he talks of returning there, just the two of us, away from the band." "Ah," the old woman nodded. "This troubles you." "Should it not? His place is here, with his people." Guyen was quiet for a moment, then set aside her work. "Come, walk with me." They moved through the camp to a rise that overlooked the entire settlement. In the fading light, Margaret could see the daily life of the Apache children playing, women cooking, men tending weapons and horses. It was a community, whole and complete. "What do you see?" Guyen asked. "A people, a family." "Yes, and what else?" Margaret looked harder. Then she understood. "They're ready to run. Everything can be packed quickly. They're always ready to flee. This is Apache life now. Always moving, always watching for soldiers. In my grandmother's time, We moved by seasons, by choice. Now we move by fear. Guyen sighed. Kuruk dreams of valley not to escape his people, but to preserve them. A place soldiers don't know. A place our children could grow without running. But just the two of us. Beginning, like first seed. In time, others might come. Those tired of running, mixed couples like you, with no place in either world. Children who are both and neither. The old woman smiled. I have dreamed this. Seen children with dark hair and light eyes, speaking both languages, walking both paths. Bridge between worlds my grandmother spoke of. That night, Margaret found Kuruk sitting alone by the horse herd, keeping watch. She settled beside him, comfortable with the silence that fell between them. Nasha spoke to me today, she finally said. He tensed slightly. Ah, she says I make you weak, pull you from your people. Nasha sees what she wishes to see. He picked up a small stick, turning it in his fingers. Before you, I was strong warrior, fought soldiers, raided settlements, lived for revenge. And now I think of other things, building instead of destroying, future instead of past. He looked at her. Is this weakness? Maybe, but I prefer it to strength that brings only death. Your grandmother told me about your dreams for the valley, not just for us. Did she? He smiled slightly. Grandmother likes to share dreams, hers and others. Is it possible what she described? Maybe, maybe not, but impossible things sometimes happen. White woman stands with Apache against her people. Apache warrior chooses life over vengeance. He reached over, taking her hand. We are already impossible. Why not dream impossible dreams? Movement in the camp below caught their attention. Riders approaching fast. Apache scouts, but their urgency spoke of danger. Soldiers, Kuruk said, already rising. We must move. The camp exploded into practiced motion. Wiki-ups came down. Goods were packed. Children lifted onto horses. Margaret found herself swept into the activity, helping where she could, marveling at the efficiency. You ride with me, Kuruk said, leading his horse to her. As they mounted, Nasha appeared. For a moment, the two women looked at each other. Then Nasha thrust a bundle into Margaret's hands. Traveling clothes, she said curtly. Apache clothes. You stand out too much in white woman's dress. It was a peace offering of sorts. Margaret accepted it with gratitude. Thank you. Nasha nodded once, then moved away to her own family. They rode through the night, the band moving like ghosts across the landscape. Margaret, dressed now in soft deerskin and wrapped in a warm blanket, rode behind Kuruk, arms around his waist. She felt the tension in his body, the constant alertness. How do you bear it? She asked softly. Always running. We bear what we must, but you see now why I dream of the valley place where children could wake without fear, where love could grow without always looking over shoulder. They stopped at dawn in a hidden canyon, as the band set up temporary camp. Kuruk led Margaret to where Guyen sat, already preparing her medicine bundles. Grandmother, he said formally, I would speak of important things. The old woman looked between them, a knowing smile creasing her weathered face. Speak. I would take Margaret as wife, not white man's way, but Apache way, if she is willing, if you approve. Margaret's heart stopped, then resumed at double pace. Wife. The word hung in the air like morning mist. Guyen turned to Margaret. You understand what he asks to be Apache wife is not easy path. Must follow Apache ways, bear Apache children, face hatred from both peoples. Margaret thought of all she'd lost, all she'd found. The choice that wasn't really a choice at all, because her heart had already decided. I understand, she said clearly. I choose this path, choose him, choose to be bridge between worlds, whatever that brings. Guyen nodded slowly. Then preparations must be made. Ceremonies observed, but first, she reached into her bundle, pulling out a small leather pouch. This was for Kuruk's wife, passed down through generations. Now for you. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside was a hair ornament, beautifully crafted with turquoise and silver. Tears blurred her vision as she understood the significance of the gift. "Thank you," she whispered. "No tears," Guyen chided gently. "This is joy, not sorrow. New beginning." She looked at Kuruk. "Take her back to Valley after ceremony. Start your impossible dream. But remember, you always have place here. Both of you." As the sun rose higher, painting the canyon walls gold and red, Margaret stood between two worlds, belonging fully to neither but claiming both. She thought of Crawford's sneer, calling her Indian lover as if it were the worst insult imaginable. Yes, she loved an Apache warrior, but more than that, she loved a man who chose life over death, hope over hatred, impossible dreams over bitter reality. And in choosing him, she'd discovered reserves of strength she'd never imagined, faced down prejudice and bullets alike, found a new family in the most unexpected place. The ceremony would come, and with it a new name, a new identity. But Margaret Sullivan, widow and outcast, had already died in that Nebraska snowstorm. What emerged was something stronger, something that could stand in both worlds and build bridges between them. As Kuruk took her hand, his eyes promising a future neither could fully imagine, Margaret whispered the Apache words she'd learned. "Shikis, my friend, Shinilin, my love, Shighai, my family, home at last." The ceremony took place under a full moon, with the entire band gathered in witness. Margaret, dressed in the beautiful doe-skin dress Nasha and the other women had helped prepare, stood beside Kuruk as Guyen performed the ancient rituals. The prayers were in Apache, but Margaret understood their essence, asking the spirits to bless this union, to make two peoples one, to bring harmony where there had been discord. When Guyen placed their hands together and wrapped them with a white cord, symbolizing their binding, Margaret felt the weight of the moment. This was more than marriage. It was transformation. The band began to sing, their voices rising and falling like wind through canyons, and Margaret felt herself carried along by something larger than her individual existence. "Now you are Itsachu," Guyen announced when the ceremony concluded. "Eagle Woman, for you soared between two worlds and chose to land here." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. There was dancing and feasting, storytelling and laughter. Even those who had been suspicious of her seemed to soften, including her into the circle of firelight and community. Nasha approached near dawn, when the celebration was winding down. "You make him happy," she said simply. "I see that now. Perhaps this is what the spirits intended all along." Margaret took the younger woman's hands. "There will be others for you, someone who will love you with their whole heart, not just from duty or tradition." Nasha smiled sadly. "Perhaps, but tonight is your night. Itsachu, may your path be smooth." 3 days later, Margaret and Kuruk prepared to leave for the valley. The band had moved twice more, always staying ahead of the soldiers, and both understood it was time. Their survival, and perhaps the survival of their dream, depended on finding that haven. "We'll need supplies," Kuruk said, checking their meager belongings. "Tools for building, seeds for planting, things the band cannot spare." Margaret touched the small leather pouch at her waist. "I may have a solution." She had kept the secret through their entire journey, but now seemed the time. From the pouch, she pulled out several gold coins and a folded document. Kuruk's eyes widened. "Where did this come from?" "Thomas had life insurance through his Masonic lodge. I forgot about it in my grief, but the policy was in our things before I left town. I managed to cash it. I've been carrying it all this time." She smiled wryly. sewn into my corset. Even Crawford didn't think to check there. "This is much money," Kuruk said, turning the coins over in his hand. "Enough to buy what we need. Maybe enough to buy the land itself, make it legal in white man's law." Margaret had been thinking about this for days. "If we own it properly, soldiers cannot drive us off." "You would use your husband's death money for this." Margaret considered the question seriously. "Thomas would want me to live, to be happy. He was a good man. He would understand that good can come from tragedy." They left the band with blessings and warnings in equal measure. The journey to the nearest trading post took 2 days of careful travel, avoiding main trails. Margaret had fashioned a simple disguise, a bonnet to hide her sun-darkened skin, a worn dress she'd kept for just this purpose. From a distance, they might pass for any frontier couple. The trading post sat at a crossroads, rough but well-stocked. Margaret entered alone while Kuruk waited with the horses, knowing his presence would complicate matters. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Josiah Finch, looked up from his ledger. "Help you, ma'am." "I need supplies," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. "Building supplies, farming tools, seed for planting, and information about purchasing land in the territories." Finch's eyes sharpened at the mention of land. "Looking to homestead, where's your man?" "Tending the horses. He's shy around strangers." Not quite a lie. "Well, land's available if you know where to look. Government's selling off parcels cheap, trying to encourage settlement." He pulled out a map, pointing to various areas. "Course, some places are better than others. Want to avoid Indian territory, naturally?" "Naturally," Margaret agreed. Studying the map, her heart leapt when she saw their valley wasn't marked as claimed. "What about this area?" "Rough country, beautiful, but isolated. Creek runs through it, good for water. Trappers used to work it, but they've moved on." He squinted at her. "You sure you want something so remote? No neighbors for help? No town close by?" "We prefer the quiet," Margaret said firmly. "How much?" They haggled briefly, but the price was fair. The land wasn't considered prime for farming or ranching. Margaret paid in gold, watching Finch's eyes widen at the coins. "Need a witness for the deed," he said, producing the paperwork. "And the name for the claim?" Margaret hesitated only a moment. "Sullivan. Margaret Sullivan and—" she thought quickly. "And Samuel Sullivan, my brother-in-law. We're farming together since my husband passed." The lie came easily. Necessarily. No courthouse would register land to an Apache and a white woman, but a widow and her relative. That raised no questions. Over the next hours, she purchased everything they might need: tools, nails, seeds, cloth, ammunition, medical supplies. Finch helped load a pack mule she bought, chattering about the challenges of frontier life. "You be careful out there," he said as she prepared to leave. "Country's unsettled. Lot of Indian trouble lately." "We'll manage," Margaret assured him, fighting the urge to defend the people she now called family. She met Kuruk a mile from the post, and they transferred the supplies to their horses. He examined the deed with interest. "Samuel Sullivan. Would you prefer I used your real name? I'm sure that would have gone well." She softened the sarcasm with a smile. "Besides, you are my family now. All the family I have." They reached the valley 3 days later. Approaching from a different direction than before, the sight of it still took Margaret's breath away. Their hidden paradise, waiting to become home. "Where should we build?" she asked, seeing it with new eyes. Kuruk had clearly been thinking about this. He led her to a spot near the creek, but elevated enough to avoid flooding, sheltered by trees but with good sightlines in all directions. "Here," he said. "House here, later. Barn there. Garden where sun stays longest." Margaret could see it in her mind's eye. Not just a cabin, but a real home. Maybe one day, children playing by the creek, other families joining them, building their own homes. Guyen's dream of a bridge between worlds made real. They set up temporary shelter and began work immediately. Karuk felled trees while Margaret cleared ground for a garden. The work was brutal, breaking her nails and covering her in bruises, but she gloried in it. Every blister was a step toward their future. Evenings were for planning. Karuk sketched the house in the dirt, showing her Apache innovations. How to build for warmth in winter and coolness in summer. How to use the natural landscape for protection and comfort. Not just Apache way or white way, he explained. Best of both, new way. 2 weeks into their labor, they had visitors. Margaret was hauling water when she saw riders approaching. Her heart hammered until she recognized them, 3 young Apache men from the band. They greeted Karuk warmly, eyeing the construction with interest. One carried a message from Guyen. "Grandmother says to plant these," he said, producing a pouch of seeds. "Medicine plants. Also says," he looked embarrassed, "says Eagle Woman should know she will be Eagle Mother before snow comes again." Margaret's hand flew to her stomach. She'd suspected but hadn't been sure. Trust Guyen to know before she did. Karuk's face transformed with joy and worry in equal measure. "You are certain." "Grandmother is always certain," the young man said with a grin. "She sends blessings in this," another pouch, this one containing herbs, "for the sickness that comes with new life." After the messengers left, promising to carry word of their progress back to the band, Karuk pulled Margaret close. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Terrified," she admitted. "But yes, happy, although now we really need to finish the house." He laughed, the sound echoing off the valley walls. "Now I build twice as fast." That night, as they lay under the stars in their temporary shelter, Margaret told him the story she'd been composing in her mind. Once, there was a woman who had lost everything. Her heart was frozen like winter ground, too hard for anything to grow. She had nowhere to go until a warrior found her in the snow and whispered, "Stay here with me. You're all I want." Karuk pulled her closer. And did she stay? She did. And in staying, she found that frozen ground could thaw, that new things could grow even in the harshest soil. That home wasn't a place, but a choice. The choice to stand with someone against all the world's storms. "It's a good story," he said, "but incomplete." Oh, the warrior was frozen too, until the woman's courage melted his winter. Now they tend the same garden, plant seeds of impossible dreams. Margaret smiled against his chest. "I like that ending better." "Not ending," he corrected, "beginning." As if in agreement. New life fluttered inside her, the first tentative movement of the child who would be born between worlds, carrying the hope of both peoples in their veins. Margaret placed Karuk's hand over the spot, sharing the wonder of it. "Ha-ah-ha-she-nada," she whispered. The sun rises again, and in their hidden valley, where no maps yet marked their existence, 2 people who had found each other in the depths of winter began to build a life that would bloom with spring. The world outside might not understand, might condemn or threaten, but here in this place they had chosen, love was answer enough to any question. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and unchanging, as Eagle Woman and Bear Warrior dreamed of the future they would create with their own hands, their own hearts, their own unbreakable choice to live. Spring arrived in the valley with an explosion of wildflowers. The meadows turned into carpets of blue lupines, golden poppies, and white yarrow. Margaret, now heavily pregnant, moved carefully through their garden, tending the vegetables that had begun to sprout. The cabin stood complete, modest but sturdy, with a stone chimney and real glass windows Karuk had traded for. Their life had found a rhythm. Mornings began with prayers to the rising sun, a practice Margaret had fully embraced. Days were filled with the endless work of survival and building, hunting, gardening, preserving food, improving their home. Evenings brought quiet companionship, stories shared, plans made for a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. On a morning when the mist still clung to the valley floor, they received an unexpected visitor. Margaret was hanging laundry when she saw a lone rider approaching. Not Apache, but a white man in clerical clothing. "Kuruk," she called quietly, and he appeared from the barn he had been building, rifle in hand but not raised. The rider stopped at a respectful distance, hands visible. "Mrs. Sullivan, Margaret Sullivan." Margaret's hand went protectively to her swollen belly. "Who's asking?" "Reverend Morrison, from Elm Creek. May I approach?" She exchanged glances with Kuruk, who nodded slightly. Slowly, "Reverend." Morrison dismounted carefully, an elderly man with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. As he drew closer, his gaze took in Margaret's Apache dress, her sun-darkened skin, Kuruk standing protective beside her, and her obvious condition. "My child," he said softly, "I've been searching for you for months." "Why?" Margaret asked, tension in every line of her body. "To bring you news. Your brother, William, he struck gold in California, made a fortune. When he learned of your husband's death, he tried to find you." Morrison pulled out a thick envelope. "He died 6 months ago of fever, but he left everything to you. His lawyers have been searching." Margaret stared at the envelope as if it might bite. "I don't understand." "There's nearly $10,000 and property in San Francisco, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." Morrison's eyes were compassionate. "Enough to return to civilization, start fresh where no one knows your current circumstances." The words hung in the air. Return to civilization, leave this valley, this life, this man who stood beside her, become respectable Widow Sullivan again. Raise her mixed-blood child in a world that might accept them if the truth stayed hidden. "And if I don't want to return?" she asked. Morrison sighed. "Then at least take what your brother left you. Use it however you see fit." He studied Kuruk openly. "I have heard stories in town. The woman who chose to stand with the savages. Some call you traitor. Others—" He paused. "Others wonder if perhaps you found something we've lost in our civilized world." "And what do you say, Reverend?" "I say that God works in mysterious ways, that love and compassion can bloom in unexpected places." He smiled gently. "I also say that the child you carry will need all the advantages possible in this hard world." Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were bank drafts, legal documents, a letter in William's handwriting she couldn't bear to read yet. "Thank you," she managed. Will you stay for a meal?" Morrison glanced at the sun. "I should return before dark, but Mrs. Sullivan, Margaret know that not everyone in town condemns you. Some remember how Crawford treated women, how those men lived by violence. They wonder if perhaps the real Christianity was shown by your Apache rescuer, not by those who claimed God's name while spreading hate." As the Reverend prepared to leave, he turned back. "The offer stands. Should you ever need it, there are those who would welcome you back, help you rebuild. But I see you've already rebuilt here. May God bless your home, unusual though it may be." After he left, Margaret and Kuruk sat by the creek, the envelope between them like a living thing. $10,000. Kuruk said quietly, "More money than I knew existed. You could go anywhere, be anyone." "I'm already who I want to be," Margaret said firmly, "where I want to be." "The child?" "We'll be born here, raised here, taught both ways, loved completely." She took his hand, placed it on her belly where their child kicked strongly. "But the money, we could do so much good with it." They talked long into the night, dreaming larger dreams. Money for supplies to help the band. Perhaps purchasing more land, creating a true haven for those caught between worlds. Schools where children could learn both languages, both ways of life. "Go Yen's dream," Kuruk said with wonder. "We could make it real." 2 weeks later, Margaret's labor began. Karuk had prepared, but fear gripped him as her pains intensified. They were alone, far from any help. "I need to get someone," he said as she gripped his hand through a contraction. "No time," Margaret gasped. "The baby comes now. You'll have to help me." What followed were the longest hours of Kuruk's life. He who had faced soldiers without flinching found himself terrified by the ancient struggle of birth. But Margaret was strong, stronger than she knew. And as dawn broke over the mountains, their son announced his arrival with lusty cries. "He's perfect," Margaret whispered, tears streaming as she held their child. Dark hair, skin the color of honey, eyes that would likely darken from their current blue, a child of two worlds, belonging to both. "What shall we name him?" Kuruk asked, touching his son's tiny fist with wonder. "Thomas," Margaret said. "Thomas Kuruk Sullivan, for the past that brought us here and the future we're building." As spring turned to summer, their valley began to see more visitors. Word had spread through the Apache network of the sanctuary they were creating. A young couple arrived first, a Mexican woman and an Apache man, nowhere safe for them to be. Then an older Apache warrior with his black wife, escaped from slavery and finding no welcome in either community. By autumn, 5 families had settled in the valley. They built homes, shared work, created a community unlike any other. Children played together, learning English, Apache, Spanish, and the universal language of acceptance. Margaret, with Thomas tied to her back in Apache fashion, worked alongside the other women. She helped establish a school, teaching reading and writing while others taught traditional skills. The money from her brother funded supplies, tools, livestock, everything needed to make their experiment succeed. One evening, as the community gathered for a shared meal, old Guyen arrived with a small group from the band. She'd come to see her great-grandchild and inspect their progress. "It is as I dreamed," she said, watching the mixed group of children playing together. "The bridge between worlds begins here." Margaret served the meal she'd prepared, a fusion of Apache tradition and frontier cooking that had become their community's signature. As people ate and talked, sharing stories in multiple languages, she felt a deep satisfaction. "Do you miss it?" Kuruk asked quietly, joining her on the cabin porch. "Your old life," Margaret considered. "I miss Thomas sometimes, Emma always, but that life," she shook her head, "that life was killing me slowly. This life makes me stronger every day. Even when it's hard, when people hate us for what we're building." "Especially then." She took his hand. "Every child who grows up here seeing no difference between colors, every family that finds safety, every person who learns that different doesn't mean enemy. That's our answer to hate." As the gathering continued into the night, someone began to tell a story. Margaret recognized it with a start. Her own story, already becoming legend. "There was once a woman who lost everything in the frozen winter," the storyteller began. "She had nowhere to go until a warrior found her and whispered, 'Stay here with me, you're all I want.' But that was only the beginning." The story had grown in the telling, as stories do, but the heart remained true. 2 people who chose each other across impossible divides, who built something new from the ashes of loss. Later, as Margaret nursed Thomas while Kuruk banked the fire, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the snow-covered prairie where she'd wanted to die to this valley full of life and hope. The future remained uncertain. The world outside still dangerous, still divided. But here in this place they'd claimed, love had built something stronger than fear. "What are you thinking?" Kuruk asked, settling beside them. That Guyen was right. Sorrow shared does become smaller, and joy shared grows beyond measure. He kissed her forehead. "Then their sons, Ha-Shinada," he murmured. "The sun rises again," Margaret repeated in English. And again, each day bringing new possibilities." Outside their cabin, the valley slept peaceful under stars. The creek sang its eternal song, and in a hidden corner of the frontier, a community that shouldn't exist thrived, proving that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the harshest ground, tended by hands that refuse to let winter have the last word. Margaret Sullivan, Eagle Woman, had found her home at last, not in a place but in a choice, renewed each day, to stand with love against a world that said such love was impossible. In choosing the impossible, she'd found that everything was possible. The sun would rise again tomorrow, and she would greet it with gratitude, her family beside her, her community around her, her heart finally, fully, home. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, courage, and redemption in the Wild West. We'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share your location in the comments so we can connect with frontier story lovers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of the American frontier. And share your thoughts about Margaret and Karuk's journey. What touched your heart most about their story? Let us know below.